Dr. Th, Professor of Biology. The lecture hall was loud, boisterous, and lively. Students from dozens of different species and perhaps hundreds of different planets all fraternized amongst themselves in total disregard for my presence upon the stage. This was, of course, to be expected of first years. Looking out over the crowd, I spotted a few members of my own species, the reptilian Ormith, chatting along with the rest. Looking back 20 galactic years ago to when I had attended this very school, it was hard not to imagine when I had been just like them, young and impressionable. Humans were a new discovery back then, and it was on that species that I wrote my now widely quoted dissertation. These youth before me were the minds that would shape the Archeron Council's future, and more than anything I hoped that someday they would change every civilized world for the better. For the moment, however, I was their professor and I had a lesson to teach. "All right, class, quiet down if you all would. I know you're here for free, but I feel I'm owed at least as much respect as a movie screen." A few chuckles emanated from the crowd upon that statement. With this being our third lecture, the students by that point had come to appreciate my somewhat dry brand of humor. Pacing across the stage and clearing my throat, I felt the spines along my neck frill up in sync with the induced cough, fiddling with the controller in my claws until the screen behind me lit up with various images comprising the intelligence gradient I first introduced during my early years as a professor. Now so ubiquitous is the image that few pre-college biology classes do not show it at some point. This week's subject, one I dearly hope you're all intimately familiar with, is Sapience. On the far right side of the screen was an image of a simple exoball virion. To the left of the first image was that of a primitive scivita, an insect from the ElevenLabs homeworld. As the images continued to the left, the creatures depicted grew more intelligent, from a Rekai serpent to an aptly named Euridian stone lobber, to a human, and finally to a myriad image composed of a dozen or so sapient species. As you all no doubt have heard, this is the facet of biology upon which I've hinged my scientific fame, so no, there is no better professor on the subject. My tail whipped back and forth in excitement as I quickly looked over my notes before proceeding. Could anyone in the class define sapience for me? Immediately, dozens of eager appendages shot up, the students to whom they belonged all bright-eyed and ready to supply me with an answer, all but one of them, at least, who was asleep with their hand held up by the tentacle of a mischievous Wisham seated beside them. Seeing that I wasn't feeling particularly cruel at the time, I decided to call upon one of the students who was actually paying attention. "You," I called, pointing to a young Korsic seated on the far left side. Sapience is defined by the Archeron Council as the ability of an organism to, in theory, construct a civilization. Her skin flashed a prideful yellow upon the apt definition, one that was just good enough to provide me with a launching site for the remainder of my lecture. "Thank you," I clicked in satisfaction, allowing the student to bask in their correctness. As you all know, the Archeron Council assesses all newly discovered planets for sapient species before any mining or colonization efforts are allowed to begin. Under most circumstances, this is an easy thing to determine. Even in a species' Stone Age, the hallmark signs of sapience are rather obvious. Hearing this, one of the Ormith I had seen earlier laughing with a friend raised a questioning claw. "What about the humans?" they asked, guessing out loud what the remainder of that day's lecture would be focused on. "What about them indeed?" I replied, tapping on the screen's image of a human, which immediately took us to the next slide. 22 galactic years ago, an expedition vessel exploring the Sol system spotted on the surface of its third planet the unmistakable light of cities. Taking a closer look, the crew found satellites and heard radio communications coming from the surface. Assuming these to be a new sapient species, a message was sent back to the Archeron Council to prepare a first contact package. In the audience, I saw a few of my students, likely those who had heard this story, tuning out. Many others, meanwhile, performed their species' gestures of curiosity. Everyone knew the Archeron Council's hallmark decision regarding this species, but not all understood how it had occurred. The galactic community was abuzz for weeks as we all prepared to greet this new species and, should they be willing, welcome them into the wider galaxy. Of course, there were some customary tests to be done to confirm them as sapient, but everyone simply assumed they would pass just as the 142 species before them did. To the shock of the entire galactic community, they failed. If humans can build cities and satellites, then obviously they're sapient, interrupted one of my students, a smaller-than-average alvacala. If our tests didn't work, then why didn't we just alter the tests instead of declaring intelligent beings to not be sapient? This was, to be fair, an entirely reasonable question. That being said, the way it was spoken left me with the unpleasant suspicion that it wasn't guided by genuine inquiry, but rather by extremist rhetoric. Nevertheless, assuming the best of my student, I replied in earnest. You see, the humans succeeded on every test of sapience but the last. I'm sure you are all aware of Archeron's law, yes? Throughout the lecture room, dozens of voices sounded out affirmation. Archeron's law is the scientific and mathematical principle that allows sapient species aware of it to construct vehicles capable of faster-than-light travel, among other things. Given that such technology is necessary for the construction of spacefaring civilizations, the Council decided that it was the best metric for determining whether or not a species was sapient. This clear-cut test served our civilization for centuries. When I was young, it was taught that any species capable of building a bow and arrow could understand Archeron's law. The humans proved this to be incorrect. Despite bearing all the traditional markers for sapience, humans failed to meet the most basic requirement for a spacefaring civilization. When it was discovered that humans had no concept of Archeron's law, we assumed it to be some bizarre societal malfunction that they simply never discovered it, but would understand if taught. Bringing the finest human physicists, mathematicians, and engineers on board research ships to teach them, however, we discovered the issue to be something far beyond that. Humans are psychologically incapable of processing Archeron's law. Not only that, but attempting to do the calculations or even reviewing notes on it seems to cause them great psychological distress. Prolonged attempts at comprehension resulted in intense migraines, hallucinations, violent panic attacks, and even psychosis. Do we have any idea why, though? Asked the Korzik from before, raising her tendril as she spoke rather than waiting to be called upon. If every other species we've seen building things like we do can understand the law, why can't humans even study it without suffering from mental damage? Barely keeping my frills from puffing out with excitement upon that question, I took a deep breath to calm myself before replying. You've chosen the right Ormith to ask. I have studied this matter extensively. I preened, skipping past a few of the slides with a mental reminder that I would return to them later. You see, the brains of intelligent creatures have to make a lot of calculations. Billions upon billions every single second. Naturally, in order to do this, evolution has figured out a variety of shortcuts to ease the monumental burden. My theory, and the most widely accepted one, is that human brains evolved to make a shortcut that those of sapient species don't. Attempting to bring attention to this shortcut by working on Archeron's law thereby results in a sort of psychological short circuit that causes the negative effects we see. Even still, cried the Alvacala, their expression betraying an intense frustration. Humans are intelligent. It's not fair to say they're non-sapient based upon something so arbitrary. I don't mean to disparage human intelligence, I replied, my frills flattening in surrender. Humans are by far the most intelligent, non-sapient animal in the known galaxy. That's why they have certain protections under the Intelligent Animal Rights Act. Deciding this to be a teachable moment, I gestured to the crowd of other students. Who here has a pet human? Immediately, about a third of those in the lecture hall raised an appendage. Humans were exceptionally popular as pets. Their hairless bodies reminded many mammalian, insectoid, avian, and amphibian species of their young, and their intelligence was leagues ahead of any other living thing one could legally own. Pointing out the Wisham who had previously raised the appendage of their sleeping classmate, I gestured for the rest of the class to quiet down as she spoke. I have a pet human. His name is Thumisk! A few of the other students displayed joy at the name. Thumisk was a popular dessert item the galaxy over, a rather pleasant name for any pet. Tell me, how smart is Thumisk? I asked, deciding it best to try and connect the theoretical concepts of sapience with something more tangible. Perking up further upon my question, the Wisham replied, He's the smartest animal I've ever met. He's attentive, always comes when called, and he helped me with my philosophy essay. Next, I called upon one of my few students whose name I had memorized. Kish, I began, gesturing toward the young Kifalt who had already attended my office hours multiple times. Perhaps not my brightest student, but easily among the most passionate. Do you have anything you wish to add? My grandfather loves humans, replied Kish, projecting onto my presentation screen an image on an older Kifalt posing with a heavily injured human. That human in the picture saved him from a malfunctioning truck. He says they're people, just like us. Mom doesn't like me talking to him. Your grandfather is entitled to his opinion. I smiled, not wishing to turn this lecture into a debate. Nevertheless, it can hardly be denied how impressive humans are. For a non-sapient species to accomplish the things they did is truly remarkable. Again, the Alvakala from before spoke up, their tone harsh enough to cut through the light chatter of other students. If they're just animals, then how do you explain the Strader pirates? They use FTL ships, don't they? Though largely quiet before this, following the mention of that group, all noise within the class died. The Straders were a group of feral and runaway humans who attacked border settlements throughout Council space. Sapient races had too many social and economic protections to fall victim to a piratical lifestyle. As such, over 90% of raiding within Council space was carried out by humans. Those animals use stolen FTL ships, I retorted, doing my best to remain level-headed in the face of this one's interruptions. Modern ship interfaces are simplified enough that a human can fly them. They still can't build ships of their own, or even maintain the ones they snatch. You claim to respect humans, but you're quick to call them animals when they actually stick up for themselves, hissed the Alvakala, standing up from their seat with a furious look in their eyes. Not one of these. Even among the extremists who sought for humans to be considered for sapient status, few were willing to justify the Straders' actions. So notoriously brutal were they that captured members were almost unanimously deemed unfit for rehoming and subsequently euthanized. I apologize, I sighed, gesturing toward this disruptive student as I labored not to glare at them. What is your name? Chalia, replied the Alvakala, their posture rigid with hostility. Listen, Chalia, I continued, my tone lacking its usual levity. Your political opinions, no matter how grotesque, are your own. That being said, politics is something we must leave at the door when we delve into matters of objective truth. Unless you'd like to be shown that door, I would advise you to refrain from further interrupting my class. Fortunately, this brief mote of proverbial fire from my tongue was sufficient to silence Kalia for the time being, allowing me to continue my lecture without further interruption. Xander Ridgeford, Strader General. November 26th, Earth Year 2103. When the Xenos first came to Earth, we welcomed them with open arms. They were everything we dreamed of when we looked to the stars, kind, peaceful, enlightened. They greeted us as friends and came bearing gifts from beyond our solar system. Their fusion reactor technology solved our energy crisis practically overnight. Their medical technology rid humanity of diseases that had plagued us since time immemorial. They were, in short, perfect. I should have known from the start it was all bullshit. No such thing as a free lunch and all. Everything went to hell when they introduced us to their spacecraft tech, and shortly thereafter, Archeron's law. Dark matter, quantum gravity, the nature of time, all of it was explained by this one rule of reality. The power of Archeron's law, however, wasn't in what it could explain, but rather what it could be used to create. Faster than light travel, antimatter mass production, and every other technology we thought to be impossible. Eager though humanity was to learn, our efforts would all fail due to what could be described as a cruel cosmic joke. We couldn't learn Archeron's law. Billions of humans tried, and even those who survived were never the same. When the aliens discovered we couldn't comprehend their technology, their attitude toward us changed. I still remember the day one of their ambassadors told us that according to their council's judgment, we weren't even sapient. Humanity's collective consciousness bubbled with outrage at this betrayal from those who had called themselves our friends. I wish we'd put up more of a fight. Sometimes as I lay down at night, I still dream of a glorious last stand. Even if we lost, at least we'd go down swinging. There was no blaze of glory, though. Instead, the citizens of Earth could only watch as our personhood was ground away by uncaring bureaucracy. All the while, the Xenos promised that if even one of us could comprehend Archeron's law, we'd be granted our rightful place as their equals. Training courses were available for free online, and a few nations even mandated that all their adult citizens undergo them. I was 17 at the time, old enough to try, but my dad insisted I not take the course. He was a brilliant man, an aerospace engineer smarter than anyone else I'd ever known. But just a few weeks in, he suffered a psychotic breakdown and blew his own brains out. By the time those damn aliens started rounding us up, Earth was down to less than half its pre-contact working population. With the most brilliant minds of our time either dead or broken, humanity had nothing to fight back with. The Xenos told us we'd all either be adopted into loving homes or suffer some other equally dehumanizing fate. Needless to say, I wasn't the biggest fan of these outcomes, so one night me and a few buddies decided we'd strike out on our own. We packed up whatever we could carry and left our phones behind so we couldn't be tracked. Douglas wouldn't shut up about our gang name the whole damn time as we walked across the countryside, suggesting we be called the Stray Raiders. Things went bad, and he ended up splitting off to distract the Xenos while the rest of us stole a ship. I never saw him again after that. The name of our movement is a tacit reference to the one he came up with. Staring out into space from the window of my command room and living space, I looked upon our small fleet of stolen ships. Most of them were simple frigates, with a few destroyers and a handful of cruisers. Our biggest ship, the one I commanded, was an Ormithian dreadnought class we dubbed the Megalodon. We were lucky to find her floating abandoned in space with her FTL drive still intact. My Meg was the Strader's pride and joy, a miniaturized mobile city that could house tens of thousands of humans. It was the last place in the galaxy where we were truly free. Only on rare occasions did we bring this massive ship along on raids. It was too valuable to risk damaging in a skirmish, so most of the time we kept her floating in deep space between star systems, far beyond the reach of Council scanners. However, for an important mission like this one, keeping our biggest gun out of the fight wasn't an option. Exiting my quarters and stepping out onto the main, I was immediately greeted by my second-in-command, Avery. While my job was to keep up our external operations, she was tasked with making sure things on the inside didn't go to shit. "What's our status?" I asked her, preparing myself mentally for whatever bullshit had cropped up during the 4 hours I'd been asleep. "You were right about their defenses, Xander," she shrugged, typing in commands to one of the bridge computers and pulling up a largely barren scanner. "Seems like most of their ships are on the ground undergoing maintenance. Whoever sold you that intel knew what they were talking about." That was good, at least. One well-placed nuke was all it would take to remove the majority of their ships from the equation. With any luck, we could then intimidate their orbital fleet into surrendering. "Good to hear," I nodded. All around us, my men raced about like coked-up soldier ants in preparation for the assault. This was the furthest into Council space we'd ever ventured for a raid. If those assholes on the ground triggered an emergency beacon, we'd only have a few hours before reinforcements came in from the next system over. "Anything else I gotta know?" "Sir, the Megalodon's FTL drive was barely functional when we found it. Parak says he doesn't know how many more jumps it can make." That was bad news. We didn't have the equipment to make repairs to such a large ship, and even if we did, it'd take more than just one person to do. "Tell him to keep her running for as long as possible. I'll figure something out after this raid." "Got it?" "Yeah, I'll tell him." Avery nodded, allowing me to pass her by without another word on my way to address the landing party. Thousands of armed humans stood at attention before me as I walked onto the elevated platform meant for the ship's captain. Our screens were linked to displays on other ships, meaning that hundreds more were also listening in. "Ladies and gentlemen, scorned children of Earth," I began, my tone laced with somber fury as I spoke. "The Council thinks we're just a bunch of animals. They think they can domesticate us into their obedient little slaves without resistance. If they won't have us as their equals, then we'll just have to cement ourselves as their superiors. They want animals? Let's show them animals. Grab your swords and load your guns. I want boots on the ground in 10 minutes. Exiting subspace close enough to the planet's orbit, our ships quickly drew attention from the active defense force. Under normal circumstances, we'd announce ourselves and broadcast demands before launching any ordnance. This was not normal circumstances. Rixiv was a large agricultural and medicinal production world, meaning it was better guarded than many of the ones we'd dealt with before. Succeeding on this raid would restore our dwindling food reserves for the next year, and maybe even more than that for medicine. With that being said, We couldn't risk them getting their defense fleet back in the air. Uploading the coordinates lent to me by our benefactor, I shouted out to my men. "That's the shipyard. Get us over it and drop the payload." Putting most of the dreadnought's power into its shields, I trusted the pilots of the other ships to keep fire off of us while we got into position. Meg's hull rattled and groaned in complaint as we rammed her through a blockade of 3 frigates surrounding Rixiv. "Sir!" shouted one of the crew from his seat halfway across the bridge from me. "I'm picking up radio chatter from the Xenos. They're halting the upgrades and prepping the rest of their fleet for orbit." "How long do we got?" I called back, prompting the comm technician to once again listen in. "Sounds like maybe a few minutes at most," they continued, their voice shaky with stress. "Divert power to engines. If we don't drop that bomb, they'll have us outnumbered 2-1. Returning attention to my own screen, I assumed direct control of the main gun and blasted a sizable hole into one previously unseen destroyer hounding our diversion ships, leaving it and presumably its crew dead in the vacuum of space. Small ordnance tapped against the Megalodon's hull like rain on a windowsill, as with a burst of speed she navigated over to where we would drop the bomb. From there, all it took was a few button presses from the crew to unclamp it from the hangar. I used to think of myself as a peaceable person. Hell, I'd never even thrown a punch before the aliens took over. That being said, watching as 100 ships went up in a bright flash of death, I found it impossible to keep a smile off my face. "Patch me through to the planet's leadership!" I barked, immediately setting my text to work. After another few minutes, an application window appeared on my screen bearing the ugly, blobfish-like face of a Rubolian glaring at me. "Straighter, scum!" it gurgled, leaning forth toward their screen. "Do you have any idea how many you just killed?" "Not as many as I'm going to if you don't call off what's left of your fleet right the hell now," I snapped back with a deranged grin, attempting to appear as unhinged as physically possible. For a split second, it seemed like the Xeno was considering my offer, but they were quick to throw it back in my face. "Not a chance!" "Welp, you heard him, folks!" I shouted to my crew, standing up from the captain's chair and unholstering the pistol that had killed my father before holding up my middle finger to the screen and with it tapping on the disconnect button. "Let's show these Xeno bastards what we're made of!"